Messieurs, dames, si vous permettez,
If you will, we will begin the 20th meeting of the Standing Committee on Canadian Heritage. Pursuant to the order of reference of Tuesday, October 16, 2007, we are dealing with Bill C-327, an act to amend the Broadcasting Act, reduction of violence in television broadcasts. We have with us witnesses from Women Against Violence Against Women, from the Media Awareness Network. We will ask you to introduce yourselves, and we will allow you 10 minutes to give a brief. Are you each giving a presentation, or are there only two presentations?
Two presentations, so 10 minutes each, and then we'll proceed to questions of alternating. We have a roll at 5 minutes each, 5 minutes of question and answer session. Who will be first?
Okay. Thank you. Good afternoon. My name is Irene Tsepnopoulos-Elheimer from WAVA, Women Against Violence Against Women Rape Crisis Center. I would like to thank you all for the opportunity to provide input to your deliberations and tell you how thrilled we are to be invited to the House of Commons to share with you some of the knowledge we have gained from doing anti-violence work at Women Against Violence Against Women Rape Crisis Center in Vancouver for the past 25 years. We're not here to engage in a discussion about censorship. When we have material that needs to be censored because it is deemed violent, we've already crossed a boundary. Instead of looking at censorship and boycotts as a means of creating social change, we need to examine the source of the violent imagery and not the media through which it is disseminated. It is difficult to determine whether media violence helps to create violence or if it is a representation of the values and the very real violence in our society. In addition, it is a very difficult task to determine what messages are portrayed by the depiction of violent acts as the context in which they are presented changes their impact. Nor is it a given that reducing the depiction of violent acts actually addresses the real root causes of violence. We do know that open dialogue can change attitudes and minds, and the media can be used to great effect to generate this kind of dialogue if the will and the support is there. What we need more of are the kind of messages that promote a positive, empowered view of women and the relationships we have, and also messages that provoke the questions in dialogue about what we as a society continue to allow as acceptable behavior. Many of the most insidious gender stereotypes that can lead to violence seem innocent and even desirable to many. There is plenty of room in the advertising world to provide a contrast to violence as usual, but those who would create and distribute those messages are competing with the corporate dollars that pays for sexy and sexist ads to sell anything, and with ad standards in the case of our public broadcaster CBC, that are stricter and limit advocacy advertising in a way that product ads are not. We must remember that we are having this conversation in the midst of Canada and the U.S. waging war and killing other human beings. We are here with a firm grasp of the climate in which Canadians are living and the reality of violence against women in Canada. What is violence against women? Violence against women is defined as any act that results in or is likely to result in physical, sexual, or psychological harm or suffering, including threats of such acts and coercion or arbitrary deprivation on liberty, whether in public or private life. Now, why does violence against women happen? Violence against women could be attributed to a number of socio-cultural factors, including historically unequal power relationships between men and women, differentiated socializations of boys and girls, women's unequal access to the political, economic, and legal sectors of society, unequal symbolizations of women's and men's bodies, the use of violent means to solve interpersonal conflict. Violence in Canada looks like this. In 2002, 69 women were killed by a current or ex-spouse, boyfriend or ex-boyfriend. That's 1 to 2 women per week. A minimum of 1 million Canadian children have witnessed violence against their mothers by their fathers or father figures In 52% of these cases, the mother feared for her life, and in 61%, the mother sustained physical injuries. Children who witness violence against their mothers often exhibit signs of post-traumatic stress disorder, and their social skills and school achievement are adversely affected. 1/2 of all Canadian women have experienced at least one incident of sexual or physical violence. In 2002, 27,100 sexual assaults were reported to police, approximately 10% of all sexual assaults that year. 1 in 6 women are abused during pregnancy. Between April 1st, 2003 and March 31st, 2004, more than 95,000 women and children were admitted to 473 shelters across Canada. 40% of women in Canada have been sexually assaulted. Aboriginal women aged 25 to 44 are 5 times more likely than non-Aboriginal women of the same age to die of violence, and more than 500 Aboriginal women have gone missing or have been murdered over the past 30 years. The estimated cost of violence against women in British Columbia, including policing, incarceration, healthcare, transition houses, sexual assault centers, lost work time, child services, and court proceedings, is approximately $1 billion. In Canada, the cost is over $4 billion per year. Kofi Annan, the former United Nations Secretary General, said, "Violence against women is perhaps the most shameful human rights violation, and it is perhaps the most pervasive. It knows no boundaries of geography, culture, or wealth. As long as it continues, we cannot claim to be making real progress towards equality, development, and peace. Violence against women is a barometer of the status in which women are held in our world, indeed our country. While Canada has implemented some formal equality measures, we've clearly not achieved substantive equality. What this committee and all levels of government should be focusing on is how to change social attitudes and power-based structures of oppression that perpetuate this violence. Instead, we've seen all levels of government entrenching inequality for women, people of color, and the poor. In the words of Zara Suleiman, a gender equality activist and lawyer, in Canada, we have the language of equality. We are signatories to conventions, declarations, and treaties that promote equality. We have the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, whose purpose is to protect and enshrine our equality rights. Our leaders speak freely and proudly of our equality in a way that assures the world that we've figured it out. Or as the website in Foreign Affairs says and highlights, we are the world leaders on gender equality. In Canada, we say one thing and we do another. Last year, we saw 12 out of the 16 Status of Women Canada regional offices closed, including the one in Vancouver. We also saw the word equality removed from the mandate for funding for Status of Women Canada grants. In Vancouver, we can invite the world to Canada for the Olympics and build, within very tight deadlines, expensive accommodations and facilities. But within the downtown east side of Vancouver, the poorest and most vulnerable of our communities are left homeless with disregard from our federal, provincial, and municipal governments. In BC, we saw drastic cuts to legal aid funding in poverty law, immigration, and family legal aid services, most that are used by women, people with disabilities, poor and working class communities, people of color, and Aboriginal communities. In 2005 and 2006, Stephen Harper committed to support women's human rights by taking concrete steps to uphold Canada's commitments recommended under the United Nations Committee on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women. One of these recommendations was to make resources available for equality test case litigation in all jurisdictions. In September 2006, the Harper government announced it would end all funding to the Court Challenges Program of Canada, which had its mandate to provide resources for test case litigation regarding equality rights. Without the Court Challenges Program of Canada, key cases that have argued women's equality rights, sex discrimination cases, pay equity, and a host of other cases involving human rights would not have been able to go forward. Women in Canada...
1 minute.
Yes. Women in Canada continue to make less money than men. If women were indeed equal, we would not be dealing with real-life or TV violence, and we'd certainly not be here discussing this bill. It's of no use to control images of violence on television without eliminating inequality of women and marginalized groups in reality. As I said earlier, what we need more of are messages that break the spell of violence as usual, and to this end, WAVA is currently launching a youth-driven, web-based awareness campaign to end violence against women by busting gender myths and stereotypes. Through our Superpower project, we've recognized that the medium of television is not the only influential broadcast avenue with which we can address the issues of violence, especially with youth. When youth are engaged and educated, they become leaders in social change. They become active agents in shifting paradigms that will contribute to ending violence. We're starting to see this happen with the multicultural youth in both Vancouver and Aboriginal youth in Kitimat Village that are collaborating on this project. We'd like to see similar programming on television support of an integrated strategy to end real-life violence.
I apologize, I have to interrupt you. We are going to stick to the 10 minutes. I've gone slightly over, so... It's
done. Thank you very much on all of us at WAVA, Rape Crisis Centre, and the women that we work for. Thank you very much.
Well, anyway, we'll go on to Ms. Wing for the Media Awareness Network. 10 minutes as well.
Thank you. I think I better throw some of my pages out right now, or speak really quickly. My name is Kathy Wing. I'm the co-executive director of the Media Awareness Network, Réseau Éducation Média. I'm very pleased to be here today to present the submission to the Standing Committee of Canadian Heritage as it debates Bill C-327, an act to amend the Broadcasting Act. We laud the motivation behind this bill, protecting the health and the well-being of Canadian children. And we welcome this opportunity to illustrate the critical role that media education plays in supporting the healthy development of children and in giving Canadian citizens, adults and children, the tools they need to effectively manage media content issues. Media violence is an issue that educators, broadcasters, parents and academics have been debating for many years in this country. Throughout this long-standing debate, media education and the fostering of media literacy skills in young people have always been recognized as key elements in any effective strategy to address the issue. Indeed, the CRTC's 1996 public notice on TV violence stated that although industry codes, classification systems, and technology would play a role, public awareness and media literacy programs represented most of the solution to the issue. Our organization was born out of a CRTC roundtable on TV violence in 1995 and was initially formed under the auspices of the National Film Board of Canada. Since that time, this national, bilingual, not-for-profit education organization has firmly established itself nationally and internationally as a leading centre in media education. And since our inception, we've been fortunate to have had the long-standing support of Canadian media industries and the Government of Canada, both through financial contributions and participation on our Board of Directors. Our vision is to ensure that Canadian children and youth possess the necessary critical thinking skills and tools to understand and actively engage with media. Belief in the importance of media literacy in the education of young people is growing in this country. It is now a mandated area of curriculum in every province and territory, and our resources and programs are used in every jurisdiction in Canada by school boards, faculties of education, libraries, and community organizations. Young people today often are spending more time interacting with media than they are in school. And when they're using media, watching television, listening to music on their iPods, surfing the web, they're absorbing a large part of their knowledge about the world and themselves and others. And this informal learning is generally taking place without critical reflection or guidance. For this reason, it is essential that young people are taught critical thinking skills to be thoughtful and engaged users of all media. A media literate individual has the critical thinking skills to interpret and value media content and to understand media's cultural, political, commercial, and social implications. One of the primary lessons of media education is that media productions are not reality, but are deliberate constructions and the result of a series of choices. Media education encourages young people to consider the role of violence in media. Is it essential to the plot of a movie? Is it factored in just for drama or excitement? What are the differences between real-world violence and media violence? Is the violence shown to have realistic consequences, or does it trivialize the psychological and physical trauma of real-life violence? How is it used to sell films to international audiences? What is the role of violence in news programming? What are the impacts on society? And how do factors such as age, gender, race, religion, and cultural background affect how we interpret violent media? Media education curriculum also teaches students they have a voice and a role to play as active media consumers who can talk to the entertainment industries and express their opinions through the mechanisms we have in place in Canada to address media content issues. There is a body of research emerging that is examining media literacy as a health promotion strategy. Several studies point to its effectiveness in mitigating potential negative media influences on the physical and mental well-being of children and youth. For example, research has indicated media literacy lessons incorporated into standard curriculum can help reduce potentially harmful effects of TV violence on very young viewers. One U.S. study of 3rd and 4th graders who were given a course in media literacy decreased their time spent watching TV, playing video games, and reduced their use of verbal and physical aggression as judged by their peers. Another study of a year-long media literacy curriculum found children in early grades watched less violent TV and identified less with aggressive characters after the intervention. Other studies have concluded that media literacy can help high-risk youth develop more responsible decision-making skills in their lives. An evaluation of a media literacy intervention program implemented by the Massachusetts juvenile justice system showed that learning to deconstruct media messages helped juvenile offenders think critically about the consequences of risky behaviors and help them develop strategies to resist these impulses in their lives. Helping to support the healthy development of children and youth with the acquisition of media literacy skills has become more critical than ever today as our young people turn to the Internet as their main source of entertainment, information, and communications. Our media environment has changed considerably since Canada's broadcasting initiatives were introduced to address TV violence. The convergence of media platforms and availability of wireless communications technologies means that rating and classification systems, legislation, industry codes, and guidelines are no longer enough to protect children, particularly as they increasingly use the Internet to access video games, television, movies, and music. We were born at the same time, actually, as the World Wide Web, and we've grown with the Internet. We've watched its potential being realized, and we've monitored the risks and concerns associated with its use. It was clear from the start that the Internet would bring new challenges to many of the media issues of concern that we were dealing with, particularly media violence. In 2005, we conducted a national survey of more than 5,200 Canadian students about their Internet use. 1/3 of kids' favorite websites contained violent content. And 34% of grade 9 boys said they had visited a violent gore site on purpose. New research from anti-racism organizations shows that violent and hateful content is growing in interactive web environments, such as social networking sites and user-generated video sites. In this new media landscape, where our young people are moving beyond geographic and regulatory borders to access media content, responsibility for protecting children is shifting to individual households, schools, and communities. There is no question that media violence is and will continue to be an area of concern to Canadians, as evidenced by the proposed legislation from the Honourable Member from Rosemount-La Petite Patrie. As media violence continues to be debated in our public institutions, Media Awareness Network encourages all Canadians to support the practice of media literacy as a key response to media content issues of concern. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We'll now proceed to the questions. Madam Fry.
Thank you very much, and I want to thank both groups for coming in and sharing your experience and some of your knowledge with us. My first question obviously is directed to WAVA, and I gather that either Irene or Odalia could answer it, depending. You talked a lot about the need to change social attitudes and the power imbalance that creates in society, in spite of the laws that we have, creates that violence in reality. Have you been able to do any research, or do you think that research on the impact of the increasing number of gratuitous quote-unquote sex and the very young prepubescent girls that sell things on the media has made a difference to violence against women, in fact, and younger women. Have you done that research? Do you think that research is necessary? How have you been impacted by the lack of money for research due to the closing down of the research arm of Status of Women Canada? So that's for you. And then I will ask Kathy one question again, if you don't mind, Kathy. You made a very important point that Internet use is obviously, if we talk about violence in television, it may be useless if we don't look at the other platforms, because those platforms could be there for people to watch just as well as television. And you're suggesting that if we did some education and media awareness and give media literacy skills to young people, that it will help them to deconstruct the violence that they see in TV. How do you propose to go about doing that? Does that mean that if they have the skills to deconstruct, it doesn't matter what they see then, that they would be able to sort of filter it and understand it and put it into perspective? And the other piece that attaches to that is that we talk about that in terms of fantasy TV, movies, film, etc., but then the news shows us violence against women and young people, especially in war zones and in areas where there's civil, and the ability to differentiate between the two becomes increasingly difficult for young people. So if you could answer me those questions, I'd be pleased. Thank you.
Research is very important. It's an important factor that allowed us to gather all these stats that have brought us to the substantive knowledge that we have that's come up to this point. Of course, the frontline workers, the activists, the women that are working with women who experience violence and the children, we need to be able to work together so that we can continue to get a really clear picture of where we're going. And so research is always important, and it's important that the organizations that work in the anti-violence field are working with the researchers. And so I think that's one of the very important pieces to looking at ways of ending violence in real life. And of course, for television, the same. I think we've all realized that what we see on TV is an expression of what we're living. And I think that, again, it's very important to have strategies that deal with what images are being portrayed. We'd like to see financial incentives that promote attitudinal and social change towards equality. I think that's the way to tackle what we already have, the same old business as usual, violence, here we go again. So the support is very important, this financial support in giving airspace for public service announcements to social justice and equality-seeking organizations. I think that if we also had opportunities to use the airspace and to provide alternatives, I think that's a space that we also would like to be supported in, and especially with the youth, we want them to have not only education and critical thinking abilities and understanding how media plays itself out, but we also want them to be active agents. We want them to be able to participate and make messages that are about social change, and so we see a clear role for youth in internalizing it and then actually being able to make the difference instead of being passive and receiving information around what media is. We want them to be able to participate and to help shape the future that is a future without violence.
Ms. Wing, I'll give you a minute. We'll be over time, and I'll make sure that we get equal time. But Ms. Wing, you have a minute.
Thank you. Yes, we don't think of media literacy as a magic bullet. Of course, there are many other people that have to play a role in this. Broadcasters have to play a role. They have to adhere to the broadcasting code for violence. Parents have a very important role to play. We all have a role to play in protecting our most vulnerable citizens from disturbing and age-inappropriate content. So there is more than media literacy that we can do. Half of children in Canada have a television set in their bedrooms. and 30% have their own internet-connected computer. We need to do a better job in reducing access, and access is the huge issue. More and more Canadians are accessing the internet through their cell phones. We have to be more active in protecting young children from age-inappropriate content, and hand in hand with that, we teach them the media literacy skills which will mitigate any negative influences of content which they will come across.
Thank you. Madame Mourani.
Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good afternoon to you, ladies. I would have a question for you, Ms. Wing. Recently, we met with the CRTC, who explained to us the current system. A system based on self-regulation and depending on the industry itself. And the industry has to respect this code, has to apply the code, and it's also based on a complaints-based system. The CRTC will not go and see whether there are problems, but will await complaints. We were told by the CRTC that the current system works just fine. My question to you, who work in the area, and you see the impact of violence on television on young people, do you really believe that the self-regulation system, whose codes and regulations were drafted by the industry and were validated by the CRTC and based on a complaint system, is that system adequate?
As media educators is to make sure that we have a well-formed populace that understands the mechanisms that are in place in Canada. And I think that they are not well understood. And that's what we try to teach young people. We try to teach them the role of the codes, of the Broadcast Standards Council, and of the CRTC. So those are important, mechanisms that are in place in Canada that Canadians need to know about, especially young people. We have teaching lessons on our site where kids develop their own television code, where they mentor younger kids, where they talk to younger kids about the impact of violence on them. So, we teach them about the different mechanisms which exist, but also, I have to come back again to the whole idea of access. That, a watershed hour in a country with several time zones is not as effective as it could be. We have satellite television, we have internet access, we have many things in the homes that mean that children will be accessing content which is inappropriate to them. So regardless of the best efforts of the industry, and so as parents, I think we need to take up and take an active role.
Je suis d'accord avec vous que les parents.
I agree with you that parents and young people have an active role to play. I'd even say that myself, having worked with young people, we need to raise their awareness, we need to educate them. But do you not believe that there is a certain responsibility that lies with the state through these organizations such as the CRTC? In my view, I was wondering whether the bill, which calls on the CRTC to establish a regulation in order to decrease violence on television, do you think the current system, which is based on self-regulation and is based on a complaints system by which the CRTC does not get too involved in that matter, do you not think the CRTC has a crucial role to play, a more direct role to play, rather than await complaints? And this is beyond the issue of raising awareness, because I agree we have to educate young people, parents, the society in general. I'm talking about the role of the CRTC in this case.
Well, as an educational organization, not an advocacy organization. I have to say that we do advocate for education only. So we look at the systems that are in place in the country, we educate people about them, we show them the debates. As a matter of fact, we have a very interesting media violence section on our site, and those materials have been the most downloaded materials on our website since we went online. What we do is we show the studies. We show the studies that show that there is a causal effect with aggressive behavior, and then we show the studies that show there is no causal effect. We lay out all the information and let people educate themselves. We let them bring those debates into the classroom. That is what we advocate for, is education, critical thinking.
Merci. Merci.
Thank you. Your time is up.
Thank you, Chair. And I want to thank the witnesses for being here today. And I want to say I'm particularly happy that WAVA is represented here today, and I want to thank Ms. Sapnopoulos-Elheimer and Ms. Israel for their presentation. WAVA has made a huge difference on the lower mainland of British Columbia, both in supporting women who've been victims, or victims is probably the wrong word. You'd probably correct me if I, but who've experienced violence and supported them through that experience, but also sought social change that really has had a positive effect on our community. And whenever you invite WAVA to a meeting, the clarity of the challenge that comes from WAVA has always been helpful to me, both as a man but also as an elected official, and you've done that again today, so thank you. I wanted to ask a couple of things, and they're kind of probably more specific than I want to be, but you did mention the importance of advocacy advertising and the difficulty or the impossibility of getting that on the public broadcaster, in particular the CBC. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about how you perceive that and the importance of that, and particularly with regard to the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation and Radio Canada.
Do you want to? Okay, maybe both of us. Okay.
I think that this particular topic was brought up in conversations with colleagues of ours that have done work in the past with companies like Adbusters, where popular media has been taken and shifted into attending to more social justice-based ideals and starting to challenge and support people to critically think about the continuous perpetuation of very specific stereotypes in society. And so I think in particular those types of kind of subversive ways of getting people to start thinking critically are seen as advocacy type of projects or images, and they've been stopped from being kind of in the mainstream. They've been kind of relegated to a special interest kind of grouping. So I think that was specifically around images like that.
So it's been impossible to get that kind of counter message on public broadcaster, but on the airwaves generally.
Right.
I think Adbusters has a court case that's proceeding. I think they just had a setback with that court case recently, but I know that they're continuing to pursue that, and I appreciate the importance of needing to get that kind of message on the airwaves. You mentioned in your presentation about financial incentives to attitudinal change, and I wondered if you had any specific suggestions, or I think you were getting into some of the specific project work that you were actually doing at the end of your presentation when the time ran out, but I wonder if you might tell me a bit more about what you had in mind there.
Well, first of all, we'd like to have money to be able to do advocacy. Advocacy has been, you know, it's forbidden, and it's you know, dangerous for the survival of organizations. We can't do that, and it's impossible to do social change without advocating for change. And so that's a conundrum. Organizations like ours, we've been around for 25 years. We don't even think about being able to have a spot on TV to do any even education or awareness or any kind of commercial or any access. I mean, it's not even in the realm of the imaginary at this point. So what we do is we work with youth, and we work with male youth and female youth, and to be able to work with them not only for awareness and education, but actually to get them to make and create stories, and with this particular superpowered project, they get to put out their own commercial, their own talk show, and so they really get to be actors. And that is, we've seen how that changes once that youth, that male youth, that female youth, once they get an idea of what that looks like, creating their reality instead of being passively accepting what's on TV, they're ingrained for life, and they have a new sense of being actors in the world, and they're actors that then go on and make social change. So we'd like a national strategy, a strategy to end the violence against women. We have an idea of using a feminist gender budgeting framework that supports all full human rights and equality for all women and peoples in Canada. So we need to be really focused on a comprehensive strategy on how to do this work, including youth and media.
Thank you. Mr. Chong.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you to the witnesses for appearing here today. We're studying a bill here in front of us today called Bill 327, which is a bill whose purpose is to reduce violence on TV. So this obviously touches on the issues of censorship and the like. But on the other hand, we also live in a liberal democracy where fundamental principle is that citizens are free to act as they so wish, free to express themselves as they so wish, provided that that expression or those acts do not harm others or don't harm others in a way that's unacceptable to society at large. So, we have free expression in this country. That being said, this free expression is limited by libel, by slander laws, by the potential harm that expression could cause to others. And there's a lot of jurisprudence around this in regarding books and film. Over the years, the Supreme Court's interpretation of this area of law has evolved from one of a community standard involving public decency and public morality to one involving harm, the harm test, where what is acceptable is or not acceptable is decided on the basis of whether or not the materials cause harm to others. And so my question is concerning this harm test. Now, we're studying the issue of television with this bill, and television is satellite, cable. It's not the same as books and film. Books and film are in the private domain. Television, cable, satellite is in the public domain, but I think there are parallels between the jurisprudence that's been developed with the Supreme Court's rulings on books and film and what goes on television. So my question for the panelists is, can you point this committee to any empirically based studies that have been undertaken that tie and make definitive links between violence on TV and harm to others in society? So maybe I'll start with, Mr. Chair, through you, if we could start with Madame Wing and hear her response on that.
Well, you will have to check out our media violence section because we have a very good research section in there. There have not been a lot of longitudinal studies on the impact of media violence on aggression, and one of the only ones that has come out of the U.S. Didn't look at the context of the violence or of the television that the participants were using. So it's quite often there's no contextualization of the violence, or it's just television in general that in the longitudinal studies. So it's and as I said, there's a lot of studies that will show you that there is no causal effect. One thing that has been shown is that, and this has been shown with violent cartoons, is that children will act out immediately after viewing a violent cartoon. So they tend to have more aggressive behavior immediately after. That has been shown in several studies. But as far as longitudinal, changes in behavior, there's very little out there.
I was going to say that I find it difficult to determine what causes harm, because I think that if you're consistently socializing children and youth about how they're supposed to behave in society, and intrinsically in our current binary system, men are shown to be aggressive and women are shown to be passive, then what is the true harm? Are we then teaching children to reproduce these stereotypes, and then what does that look like in the public and private domain, right? So I don't necessarily know about, I mean, there's tons of studies out there, and I've read several that, from R-rated and X-rated movies and how that translates into intimate relationships to violent cartoons. I mean, there's tons of studies out there, but what you're measuring is really the question, right? Are you measuring whether people are able to walk in the world and have substantive equality relationships with each gender? Are you measuring whether somebody gets physically assaulted after they watch this? I think that's the bigger question. It's what are we actually measuring? Are we measuring for a better and just society, or are we measuring for people not being abusive physically or verbally or sexually towards one another? So I think that's the bigger question for me.
I would also like to add to that the research with children, I don't believe they've ever looked at the, and with the stats that I presented about children witnessing, over 1 million children witnessing violence in their own homes. I don't believe, and maybe if you have any evidence of this, but they've never asked whether or not these children were also in a violent home. And so that to measure whether or not the experience and then the reaction to something that was on TV was also supported by their actual experience in real life and actual experience in schools and actual experience in playgrounds. So I don't think those studies have been done, and I think research is a very important tool, and it's very important to research reality in all of it.
Colleagues, we could do a second round, a quick second round of 3 minutes each, with three, so that would bring us to just about ready to go into our second panel. Fair enough? Mr. Scott?
Thank you very much. Thank you. It's been very enlightening. I think it seems to me that what we're discussing is whether or not the best approach to dealing with something that we all, I think, would like to do something about is to be prohibitive or more proactive in the context of education and media awareness and so on. For instance, is everybody here aware of what currently exists on the prohibition side, like what the restrictions are, how you would access them? Have you ever filed a complaint? Is anyone here aware of on the limitation side, on the restrictive side? I'd like to know if anyone's ever used it, or do you know anybody who's ever used it? So there's an awareness feature just in terms of what the prohibitions are now, I think. That's what I'm getting. Let the record show there's some head nodding going on that I'm sure is going to be difficult to put in the transcript. So that would be, you can answer that question verbally in a second. And then secondly, is there a developmental issue here? Because I hear particularly from WAVA, is it WAVA? Particularly that, there's a broader issue. And so I take the point that it's one thing to say whether or not television is causing the kid to go out and do something that's obvious and immediate and physical perhaps, or verbal, but it's quite another just generally what they're growing up with. And maybe the better response in terms of a strategy is to deal with the developmental issues, to deal with the socialization issues, and maybe restrictions would even stunt some of the developmental issues. If you said, no, we don't want anybody to be exposed to that, and then all of a sudden at some point they are, and have not been, no discernment, no critical thinking, no one's ever talked about it. I mean, I think these are legitimate questions as to how you approach solving this problem.
Head nodding because there's 1 minute left. That's it.
First question, were you referring to using the Canadian Broadcast Standards Council? No, I mean, I do visit the site, I do read the reports. I know that Canadians, do use it to lodge complaints. We have not. The health component is really important, and the developmental component I think is really important. It's too bad that there aren't health experts here because they could speak to this with more authority than we can. Certainly, health experts. There is a general accepted, theory that there are some children that are much more vulnerable to disturbing age-inappropriate media than others. So those would be children who were facing violence in their real life, who are more sensitive. There are definitely children that are at more risk. I'm sorry.
Okay, thank you. Monsieur Malo.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Ms. Wing, in your comments, you noted that the organization for which you work conducted a number of studies in the past few years. Among those studies, I'd like to know whether there are figures that can be shown displaying the level of violence in media.
No, the two main studies that we've conducted are on children's internet use. So we conduct the largest study in Canada, funded by the Government of Canada, on children's internet use. And we did it in 2001 and 2005. We spoke to over 5,000 students. And that's where we found out about their exposure to different types of age-inappropriate offensive content on the internet. We've also done market research just with parents to find out what their concerns were, and with teachers to find out about their concerns and about media literacy in the classrooms in Canada. But as far as the levels of violence, no, we did work with the Canadian Teachers Federation, who did a large-scale study in 2003 called Kids Take on Media, which really set out to look at what kind of violent media children were being exposed to. And that's a very interesting study because it showed that children in grades 3 to 6 were playing Grand Theft Auto, which is a mature-rated video game. So it did show very high levels of exposure to violent media through video games, television, movies, and it also showed there was a lack of parental involvement in children's media use.
Donc, si je comprends bien, l'organisation pour laquelle vous travaillez.
So if I understand correctly, your organization is more devoted to the internet rather than to television, and more to video games than to television.
Well, certainly with the internet, there was not a lot of education happening as the country was being connected up. And so, there was a connectivity agenda to get all our schools and libraries connected. Those are two of our large stakeholder groups. So, in fact, we did end up doing a lot of research and a lot of work in this area, yes. But the study through the Canadian Teachers Federation, we were a partner in that study. And that's probably the largest scale study of exposure to media violence in Canada right now.
Merci.
Merci. Mr. Fast.
And thank you to the witnesses for attending today. I'd like to address a question to Ms. Wing, if you would answer. You focused on the fact that your organization actually focuses on media literacy and education, educating the public on media issues, correct?
Yes.
Now, I did also notice that you refer to two other parties that have a responsibility, and that was the parents. And I applaud you for acknowledging parents have a critical role to play, making sure their children are aware of some of the dangers that lurk, either in television, on the internet. And then thirdly, you referred to the broadcasters. And I agree with you there as well. The one party you didn't mention, which is the focus of this particular bill, is the government. If I might just read to you the actual operative section. If you drill down, there's one operative section, and it says, the Commission shall make regulations respecting the broadcasting of violent scenes. That's a very, very broad statement. it isn't restricted just to viewing hours. It's the whole area of broadcasting violent programming. And I'm wondering, do you feel that the federal government has a larger role to play, as suggested by this bill, in regulating broadcast violence, or do you believe that the voluntary code, which is actually not voluntary, it's part of the licensing scheme, but that the industry has agreed to, is sufficient to play the role that government typically would play?
I believe it is effective, and I think the fact that the Canadians are not lodging complaints to a huge degree since it's been in place is perhaps evidence. I mean, it could be evidence that they're not as well educated, of course, about the mechanisms. But, you know, I think the government should be funding research. I think they should be funding NGOs. I think they should be funding education organizations such as ours. I think there is a huge role for government to play.
So you're saying that the current broadcast standards, which are made part of the licensing for the broadcasters, is sufficient and is doing the job it's supposed to do. Is that correct?
We believe it is.
All right, thank you. And perhaps to the other two witnesses, if one of you could answer. I didn't actually hear from you whether you support the legislation or not. I've posed a question to Ms. Wing. Perhaps you could answer the same one. Do you believe that a greater government role in regulating violence on TV is required, or do you believe the current broadcast standards are sufficient?
The broadcast standards, as I understand them, and the criminal code covers the material. I think that it's opinion for myself, and WAVA has not come out with a position on this, but I think that does it. And then the other part is that the bill, from our perspective, is fundamentally flawed because it is a standalone. There isn't a comprehensive way of looking at the big picture violence, and there aren't the other mechanisms that you want to have in place to support NGOs and research and the activities that go along with making a difference, the difference that we think might be made here. We don't believe this is the way to do it.
Clarification.
Thank you very much, Mr. Fest. I want to thank our witnesses this first hour for your respect of the constraints of time that we have, and we thank you for your help in helping this committee in coming to grips with this the complexity of the issue before us. Thank you very much. We'll now change the witnesses for the second round. A couple of minutes. Well. Colleagues, will undertake the second round, but I need to remind folks that we're expecting bells convening us to a vote to start ringing at 5:15. So we have less than an hour, so I'll try to keep us moving expeditiously. Monsieur, who will want to make the presentation? Mr. Cohen, please.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Thank you very much, everyone. My name is Ronald Cohen. I'm the National Chair of the Canadian Broadcast Standards Council. With me today is John McNabb, the Executive Director of the CBSC. Je remercie le comité de nous avoir invités à exprimer notre...
I would like to thank the committee for inviting us to express our views on the bill. We are also grateful that we have been accorded the opportunity to speak at the end of these deliberations. This gives us the opportunity to respond to issues raised during the appearance of other witnesses. And we will, of course, look forward to the additional questions you will have for us.
Let us begin by making our position utterly clear. We do not believe that Bill C-327 is either necessary or even moderately useful in dealing with the issue of violence on television. We have filed a written presentation with the committee clerk that will hopefully provide a useful tour d'horizon of the issue, and I will try to limit this oral presentation to the clarification of matters raised by witnesses and members of this committee. First, the nature and extent of the problem, namely the exposure of our children to violence in the media. Is problematic violent content increasing or decreasing? The answer is that it is decreasing. The best evidence of this, as mentioned by Kathy Wing as well a few moments ago, is the level of complaints filed with the CBSC and the CRTC. These indicate that between 2000 and right up to date, February, the end of February 2008, the level of complaints about violence on television has fallen by 22%. The statistics cited by Monsieur Bigras are neither recent nor appropriate. They do not extend beyond 2002, and even then, they do not disclose what they cover or represent. It is essential to acknowledge, members of the committee, that not all violence is created equal. And yet the original study of Messieurs de Guise et Paquette, covering the period 1993 to 1998, made no distinction between appropriate and inappropriate violence. Monsieur Bigras referred to the eminent authority in the area, Professor George Gerbner, with great respect this past Tuesday, but what he did not acknowledge to you was that the Laval study did not follow Professor Gerbner's methodology. The authors of the Laval study said, contrairement à Gerbner, qui considère les séquences...
Contrary to Gerbner, who considers the sequences of violence, we have decided to count the numbers of violent acts. Each gestures, each action, and each event are considered as distinct acts of violence.
They underscore that the numbers they report are exaggerated. Moreover, they make no distinction between our common goal of protecting children on the one hand and violence that may not be problematic or inappropriate at all on the other. The bottom line is that there is simply no evidence that there is, in 2008, any problem that needs parliamentary intervention of any kind. Second, the system is actually working. Lorsque M. Scott faisait remarquer mardi,
When Mr. Scott observed on Tuesday that he knew that Mr. Bigras believed that the present system was failing, he added that he had not understood Mr. Bigras' explanation as to why he thought that the system was failing.
to the question put by Mr. Abbott regarding the absence of complaints about children's programming subsequent to the CBSC's Power Rangers decision. Monsieur Bigras was either unable or unwilling to cite a single example of problematic children's programming since the 1994 CBSC decision. It's because there hasn't been one. Third, much justification for C-327 has been placed on the fact that the violence code is voluntary. The only aspect, members of this committee, of the violence code that is voluntary is its title. As the CRTC chairman said on Tuesday, the code is obligatory. It is a condition of license for every television broadcaster in this country. It could not be more involuntary. Moreover, the statement by M. Bigras that the adjudication is undertaken by industry peers, les pairs qui a mentionné, is totally wrong. The adjudicating panels are all composed of at least 50% members of the public, including former CRTC commissioners, former members of Parliament and cabinet ministers, a former provincial premier, a former lieutenant governor, communications professors, the former head of the Vanier Institute of the Family, the head of the Centre de Recherche Action sur les Relations Raciales de Montréal, the former head of Media Watch, and many other highly credible and committed Canadians who are devoted to public service. Fourth, much emphasis has been placed on the fact that the violence code is the creation of the private broadcasters. I will not dwell on the notion that because broadcasters had something to do with its creation, they would have done so only to serve their own self-interest. That concept is outrageous. Any one of you will readily confirm, on the basis of your own constituency experience, that local broadcasters devote considerable time, energy, resources, and promotional benefits to telethons and other local community initiatives. In good times, in bad, in ice storms, fires, and floods, broadcasters are there for the good of the public. Leaving that aside, do not forget for an instant that, as the CRTC chairman pointed out Tuesday, the Commission vetted every word of the violence code before it was approved. And having participated in that process in 1993, I can tell you on an anecdotal basis that the wording went back and forth several times before all of the CRTC's issues were resolved. Moreover, the consultation process with stakeholders was substantial. During the development of the code, comments were invited from many public representatives, a list of which is appended to the CBSC's written presentation, which the clerk has had distributed to you all. The public organizations included Media Watch, OWL Center for Children's Film and Television, the Alliance for Children and Television, l'Association nationale des téléspectateurs, le groupe de recherche sur les jeunes et les médias, pour la coalition contre la violence dans les émissions pour enfants, le Conseil du statut de la femme, Canadians concerned about violence in entertainment, the Animal Alliance of Canada, among others. Fifth, Monsieur Bigras is not satisfied by the present complaints-driven system. He proposes a monitoring system of some unspecified description. I fully expect that Monsieur Bigras was surprised, if not shocked, to learn that both the CRTC and the CBSC operate on the basis of complaints made to them by members of the public. That was unequivocally confirmed by the CRTC chairman on Tuesday, and that is as it should be for two reasons. First, censorship is anathema to Canadians. When Mr. Abbott asked Monsieur Bigras whether the bill's proposer was not talking about censorship, Monsieur Bigras was at pains to avoid such a characterization. Understandably. He admitted that he did not favor censorship, yet that is essentially the effect of Bill C-327. Let us not mince words. That is exactly what a monitoring system not based on public complaints is. Censorship, nothing more or less.
We'll have to conclude, Mr. Cohen.
Mais je suis en train de couper ma propre période de temps, non? Je peux...
Can I use a little extra time? One more minute?
That in detail, you have it in my, well, you don't have it in my oral presentation, but you can. Any system, as Mr. von Finkenstein said, would be very expensive and intrusive. Sixth, and I should add, of course, that the present system is paid for by the private broadcasters, so not a bad way to go. It's not the general public. Sixth, is the system really tough enough? Not the slightest doubt it is. Thanks to the CBSC all by itself, the Power Rangers left Canadian airwaves. So too, Howard Stern, Laura Schlesinger, Stéphane Gendron, and Doc Mayou. And in the children's television area, no inappropriate violent programming has ever replaced the Power Rangers in the last 14 years. Mr. Bigras a également suggéré que le système américain est supérieur.
Mr. Bigras also suggested that the American system is superior.
Since the Americans have no code, since the FCC does not deal with violence on television, and there is no equivalent body to the CBSC that deals with violence on television. So in conclusion, the question for the Standing Committee is whether there is any need for a regulatory rather than a self-regulatory framework, a statutory amendment or a government regulation rather than an industry code. If there were a problem that the present system could not deal with, of course there would be, but there is not a shred of evidence that the present system does not work. Thanks to the private broadcasters and the CRTC, Canadians have the best codified protections for children's programming in the world, and thanks to the CBSC, those standards are rigorously enforced. Thank you for the little bit of extra time as well, Monsieur le Président. We will be pleased, of course, to answer your questions.
Merci, Mr. Cohen. Mr. Scarpaleggia.
Thank you, Mr. Cohen. Mr. Scarpaleggia.
It's a very hard topic to, I find, to get a handle on. You know, when you talk about what's on the air and what should be on the air and what shouldn't be on the air and how we should govern what's on the air. There was one distinction you made which I didn't quite fully understand. Maybe you could explain. You were referring to a study by some professors or by a professor where you were making the distinction between a sequence of violent acts and measuring violence as the number of discrete or individual violent acts. Could you just explain briefly the distinction? I didn't quite understand that.
Mr. Bigras has relied in considerable measure on the fact that there is a Laval study in 2004, that's the study, that has indicated a very significant increase in the number of violent acts. The trouble is that that study, first of all, it's a little bit older than that, but it counts every individual act. No wonder the numbers are big. In other words, it's not a sequence. It's not saying, well, there was a fight sequence between two people.
Number of gunshots.
It's the number of gunshots, the number of arms swinging, and so on and so forth. It's a really poor way to do it.
Right. Now, how does one, for the purpose of the code, or even for the purpose of discussion, how does one define, violence and make comparisons between one year or one period of television history and another? I'm just thinking, violence in the 1960s. I mean, when you look at it today, maybe in those days it seemed pretty violent, but when you look at the violence on the television sets in the 1960s, when you look at it now, it's almost laughable. You know, I mean, if you the cartoon violence that one would see, or even the Gunsmoke kind of violence, and now if you look at that and compare it to the graphic violence of today, there might be less of it, but it's perhaps more shocking or damaging. So how do you control for that, and how do you define violence for the purposes of the code?
We define violence in the broadest possible way, which is to say, if the complainant says it's violent, we accept that it's violence. And our assessment basically is of two kinds. We need to determine, first, whether the violence is gratuitous, because you have to bear in mind that under the code, any gratuitous violence cannot be aired on television at any time of day or night, not at 4 in the afternoon, not at 9 o'clock at night, not at 3 in the morning, no gratuitous violence. And the second thing that we do is we look at the violence which has been the characterization of the individual complainant, and we ask, is it violence that is intended for adults or not intended for adults? If it's intended exclusively for adults, it has to play after 9 o'clock, and if it doesn't, then it falls into the acceptable category of violence. So there's no need to define it. We let the complainant say whether it is or not.
But then how do we decide who's right and wrong? Anyway, it seems very subjective, and even when one gets into the... And I'm not suggesting that I disagree with you about the merits of the bill. I'm just talking about the ideas that we're discussing. I mean, the word gratuitous is a very elastic term. I mean, you're saying television broadcasters never show any gratuitous violence. If I understood correctly, that was a pretty categorical statement.
Not exactly. What we said is that they're not allowed to show any gratuitous violence at any time of the day or night.
Okay, which brings me to my next point. How many complaints, and you said at the beginning of your presentation that, well, violence is down because we've had fewer complaints. Maybe people have just given up complaining, that could be part of it. But secondly, and then if I read in your brochure here, you say, panel decisions are released to the media and remain open to the public. If a broadcaster has breached any of the codes, it must announce that decision on air during primetime television hours or peak radio listening times. I've watched a lot of television in my time, and I've never seen a broadcaster admit to violating the code.
I need a quick question, quick answer here.
We can show you the tapes. I mean, we get the tapes from the broadcaster as part of the system. We have them. Anytime you want to look at them.
How often in a year would a broadcaster have to apologize?
Well, that varies with the year, but let's just say that about 70 to 75% of the decisions that we render, the formal decisions that we render, and I mentioned this during the CBC hearings when we were here testifying as well, go against broadcasters. We can give you the precise numbers. No problem.
Thank you. Madame Mourani.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for appearing this afternoon. I would like to know, you said that the current system is paid for by private broadcasters, and that to implement a system which would be managed by the CRTC, a more proactive and less complaints-based system would cost a lot, would be more intrusive. So is only a matter of cost? So, for instance, if the government gave you the necessary funding or gave the CRTC the necessary funding to do its work, would you be satisfied with that? No. Clearly, I think Chairman von Finkenstein was very clear when he responded to one of your questions. He was in no way in favor of censorship, and neither am I. We depend on reaction from the public. If the public has no problem with any shows, who are we to say if there is a problem? But how do you define a state where there are no problems? Is it based on the number of complaints you receive? Well, it's because it depends on the number of complaints, yes. And you must understand that we begin an inquiry with a single complaint. We don't wait for there to be 15, 20, or 100 complaints. One single complaint will trigger an inquiry process. So if not one Canadian has a problem with a given show, are you suggesting that it becomes the responsibility of the state or our organization to intervene and to tell the public that, yes, indeed, there is a problem, even if Canadians don't think there is a problem? That just doesn't make sense. But you say there is no problem. On what do you base that assumption? I'm saying there is a problem because there was a petition signed by 1.3 million people calling for some change. So I'd like to know, on what do you base that assumption? Is it on number of complaints? I've just explained it to you. You've given me the opposite example of the 1.3 million people who signed the petition. What I'm telling you is that if there isn't a single complaint, should Virginie Larivière have gone to the Prime Minister and there was not a single person who saw there was a problem with violence on television, and yet she, in 1991, she went before Prime Minister Brian Mulroney with 1.3 million signatures. What I'm saying is that when we receive one single complaint, we then undertake an inquiry. And I believe that's a reasonable approach. I heard you on a number of occasions talk about censorship. You used that word on a number of occasions. My understanding of the bill is that the CRTC will adopt regulations. I did not hear anything about prohibiting programming or broadcasting of shows, rather to broadcast shows after a certain time. So why do you talk about censorship when we're simply asking for regulations? Well, that's not the reason I raised the censorship issue. You asked that the state, either through a regulatory approach, through the CRTC, or a self-regulatory approach, be used even in the absence of any complaint. That's what we call censorship. We've already done a lot with regard to broadcasting at later hours, with regard to shows that aren't appropriate for children. This is something we already do. We don't need to make changes to the legislation in order to operate efficiently in that area. Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Morani.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for joining us this afternoon, gentlemen. I have to say that I do share a little skepticism about the definitiveness of your statement that violence is decreasing just because we don't have the number of complaints. And it would be helpful, I think, to see some other way of backing up that statement. But it leads me to a couple of questions. The Broadcast Council only deals with broadcasters that are members of the council. And can you tell me how many broadcasters wouldn't be a member of the council?
I'm not sure that we know the answer to that. Do we know the answer to that, John? How many aren't?
I think there's in the neighborhood of altogether 900-ish licensed broadcasters. That's not necessarily all broadcasting, though.
Right.
So I don't know exactly how many broadcasters are actually broadcasting. as opposed to how many are licensed.
So that means
that we have 629 members. So we've got the vast majority of the private broadcasters.
So in that sense, it is voluntary, and that
Absolutely.
A large number still aren't members of this process. Is that
Not
right?
a large number of, may I characterize them as large market broadcasters. The bulk of the licensed broadcasters who are actually functioning that are not members would be very small market radio broadcasters who are not obviously working in the area of television violence at all. But in terms of large markets, there would be very few broadcasters that aren't members, apart, of course, from the public broadcasters. Right. We're talking about the private broadcasters.
Right.
From a television perspective, almost no private broadcasters are not members.
Okay. The other day when Mr. von Finkenstein was here, he said that one of the problems that he saw with the current situation was that in terms of penalties, there were very light penalties and what he called very heavy, excessive penalties, and he called for administrative, I think he called them administrative monetary policies that would allow the imposition of fines. Do you folks have a response to that? How do you feel the penalty system works in terms of the broadcasters that you deal with?
Well, two things. First of all, you've just characterized Mr. von Finkenstein's statement as having suggested that there was a problem with very light fines. He didn't say that. What he said was that there's a range of possible recourses that go from the light end, which is statements that are required to be made, announcements that are required to be made, to the very heavy end, which he described as the blunt instrument, and that would be the removal of a license. He sought the instrument that he described as an AMP, and I must say we don't have a view on that because we don't need it. I mean, if he comes here and asks for that, then I suppose that's up to you to determine whether it's relevant or it isn't relevant. It truly has nothing to do with us. Our instrument works very effectively. We don't have a fining ability. We don't want a fining ability. If you said to me this afternoon that we could have one, I would say, why? We simply don't need it. So for us, it's irrelevant, and we can't speak to what he may or may not find relevant for his circumstance.
And of the broadcasters that you've imposed a penalty on, how many are repeat offenders in the sense that they've been disciplined more than once for some kind of for a positive finding on a complaint?
Well, first of all, that we don't keep tables like that, but the information, like everything we do, is entirely transparently available. So anyone who wished to look at our website could dig it up, but we don't keep anything like that. Let me, however, get to what I think you want out of this, and that would be to say that, not to be presuming, but to the extent that you're looking for information about persons, or I should say broadcasters, who repeat the same kind of offense, because there's a critical difference. If they repeat, what happens is we give them, again, as Mr. von Finkenstein said, if they do that 3 times, he was talking about us, what we do is we give them 30 days to explain how they will eliminate the problem in future, and if they don't, they're gone as members. The solutions that they have adopted in the past, among other things, very recently, they have gotten rid of Stéphane Gendron and Doc Mayou in Quebec. They're off the air because it would appear the broadcasters were of the view that they would not be able to deliver the kind of programming which the codes require. So that's the step which has been taken.
Merci. Thank you. Mr. Fast.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Cohn, you're a film producer by profession, are you not?
I have certainly done that in the past. Yes, absolutely, I did. I'm not sure that when you're talking to me, having had legal training long before I was a producer, that I would be entitled to say that I'm a film producer by profession.
Well, you certainly segued nicely into my next question. So you are a lawyer?
Yes.
And you have been a law professor at McGill
Yes.
University, correct? So
Yes.
I'm asking the question of the right person. And I want to refer you to Clause 3, in fact, the first paragraph of Clause 3, which is essentially the operative provision of this particular bill. And you had a chance to listen to Mr. Bigra's intervention. And Mr. Bigra went to great pains to try to restrict the ambit of his bill to the viewing hours when children would be viewing programming. And yet I'm looking at this clause, which he drafted, and to me it's much broader than what he led this committee to believe. In fact, I'll read that section. The Commission shall make regulations respecting the broadcasting of violent scenes, including those contained in programs intended for persons under the age of 12 years. So would you agree with me, as a lawyer, that in fact this provision is much broader than simply restricting viewing hours?
Well, clearly, this has nothing to do with viewing hours at all.
Exactly. And would you agree with me that this clause, although it references children, is actually much broader and actually gives the CRTC the right to regulate violence in general?
Well, clearly, because it only includes those contained in programs intended for persons under the age of 12. It says the Commission shall make regulations respecting the broadcasting of violent scenes. That's the operative provision, and it goes so far as to say that that even includes this limited category, but it clearly is a broader statement, yes.
So it's a very broad regulatory power, correct?
Yes, it appears to be.
Right. Would you agree with me that under this kind of regulatory power, it would be open to the CRTC, although I'm not suggesting it would, but it would be open to the CRTC to prohibit the showing of The Patriot, the movie The Patriot? That it would be open to the CRTC to prohibit the showing of Gladiator? In fact, it would be open to the CRTC to actually prohibit the showing of hockey games in which there's violence. I mean, from time to time, hockey games have violence, they have fights, people break their noses, they might get cuts on their brows, you might get a Bertuzzi incident or a Wayne Mackey incident from many years ago, and the CRTC under this regulatory provision would actually have the right to actually prohibit that kind of programming.
Needless to say, one of the problems with a, if I may call this a blunt regulatory instrument, is that you may also run into difficulties with the charter. That's another whole issue. But it certainly would appear to be a very broad endorsement that would be given to the CRTC. There's no indication of where these violent scenes may occur. I suppose you could look at this and say that violent scenes could occur in the news as well, and that they could be anticipated to be included here. I mean, it does seem like a very broad power, yes.
Yeah. And would you agree with me that the way this bill is drafted, it could lead to censorship on television?
Well, I might have agreed with that statement even before you started asking those pointed questions, just from reading it, yes.
All right. I want to also refer you to one portion of the preamble. And as you know, preambles typically aren't operative within bills, but in this case, the preamble says as follows: and whereas the number of violent scenes broadcast on television during the hours when children watch television, namely before 9 p.m., has nevertheless increased. Do you agree with that portion of the preamble?
Totally disagree. As we've indicated in our written document and in the oral presentation, we don't believe that there's any justification out there, any studies which would support that statement.
Those are all my questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Colleagues, might we consider doing the same second round of 3 minutes? That's fine. Madam Fry.
Thank you very much. Of course, at the heart of all of this is a concern as where censorship starts and freedom of expression, etc., end. And so this is a very difficult bill, in that you don't know where to draw this fine line. However, I do have some concerns with something that the CRTC told us at the last meeting and that you were saying. And so I'm going to ask the question again, and hopefully I could find an answer. If complaints are the only indicators you use to decide whether there is too much violence. It could be, and I think my colleague Mr. Scarpaleggio asked it, it could be that maybe the public is so inured to violence now that they don't notice it. It could be that people feel that they possibly don't get the kind of response they want and that they stop writing. I don't know. There could be those reasons. There may not be those reasons. But surely, to goodness, there are other indicators that we could use or that a self-regulatory body like yours could use to define whether or not violence is unacceptable or violence is escalating. I mean, there are the Supreme Court definition, not the Supreme Court, sorry, the Criminal Code definitions that we could look at. But is there any other way you think than simply, because for me, complaints is such a poor indicator. It's very nebulous at best. And I just don't know whether there is something else that will not become censorship, but will find a way of tracking, find a way of giving us the data we want, find a way of giving us the information we want. And could you suggest something else? I mean, I'm really struggling with this issue as to what are the other indicators we could use that would allow for self-regulation and make it effective.
I think, Ms. Fry, that Ms. Wing actually provided in the last appearance of witnesses perhaps a very good answer. I think we need to distinguish between the trending type information to which you're really referring and what it is that we do. We at the CBSC are tasked with the responsibility of responding to individual complaints. We're not tasked with the responsibility of trying to measure how much violence there is or isn't, in society or indeed, on television or in the newspapers. That's not our job. So it may be when she suggested that research and research funding might be a very good thing to do, Media Awareness Network, MNET, might be the very kind of body to supervise something like that. Our job is different, and this bill is different. This bill proposes that we deal, that the responsibility which we exercise, I believe very effectively, should be transferred over to another body where, incidentally, of course, it will cost more money.
Thank you.
But that's the difference, I think, between the two situations.
Merci, Mr. Cohen. Mr. Malo.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Merci, Monsieur Cohen.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to you, Mr. Cohen, for appearing before us this afternoon. Given that there are many broadcasters who are not members of your association, how do you react to the fact that this voluntary code can apply to all broadcasters, whether members or non-members? Do you believe that this is an approach that could be adopted? You describe the code as a voluntary one. I think it's ill-described to term it voluntary. It is not at all voluntary. The code is an obligatory one, and it is obligatory for each broadcaster in Canada, for each single broadcaster in Canada. CBC, Radio-Canada, CPAC, Télé-Québec must also address the criteria within that, what you call voluntary code, which is not at all voluntary. Even non-members have the responsibility to respect all the conditions established in the code. So my understanding is that the CRTC gives the license, and that applies to every single broadcaster in Canada. Yes. In an answer to Mr. Sixay, you said that your association did not find Mr. von Finkenstein's measure necessary, that is, a fining system for broadcasters who do not comply with the code. Could you go a little into more details? Why do you believe that it isn't necessary? Well, because broadcasters, if you will, obey to the decisions that we render. So it is in no way necessary to put a gun to the heads of broadcasters and force them to comply with the codes which we administer. I'm sure you know Doc Mayou, a well-known figure in Quebec on CHPC in Montreal. He's no longer on the airwaves. So what are you thinking about in terms of penalties and fines, which could make any different result than our own voluntary code?
Sure. Go ahead. Mr. Chong.
Mr. Chong.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I thank the witnesses for appearing in front of committee today. And first of all, we'll say that we are too opposed to this bill. But I do share some of the concerns that some of the other members of the committee have brought up, in that I don't think you can make an argument, a valid argument, that just because complaints have declined, that necessarily means that children's health has not been negatively impacted over the last 8 years. So I make that point because the CRTC's policy framework on this issue is, as you mentioned in your submission here, is not framed as a moral one, but rather as one that is based on the harm test, in other words, harm to children's health. And when we're talking about violence on TV, we have to make the connection between the two, violence on TV and whether or not it has a negative impact on children's health. And I don't think it necessarily follows that just because there's been a decline in complaints that there's not been a negative impact on children's health over that period. Furthermore, I'd also add that I believe that television viewing audiences in the last number of years have also declined. So that may in part account for the decline in complaints because of increased usage of the internet and other recreational activities that people are now increasingly turning to. So it's just a comment I make, but I've got no question, Mr. Chair. So.
Est-ce que je peux juste donner une petite clarification? Just
Can I simply clarify a point?
A position contrary to what you've just raised. It's interesting, you should be aware of the fact that the actual number of complaints that we are receiving at the CBSC is increasing. So the actual number is increasing, although you're saying that there may be some migration of eyeballs and ears, to the internet. Just to say that between the year 2000 and this year, the total number of complaints we're receiving has gone up. So just to say that they're not disappearing, maybe people are becoming more literate and conscious of.
Well, maybe, Mr. Chair, if you just clarify this, because in your report it actually says that, quote, there has been a decline of about 22% in television violence complaints between 2000 and the end of February 2008.
That's right. Yes, because the percentage of complaints that related to television violence was in 2000 12.76% of the total complaints we had received. So even though the number of overall complaints that we have received has gone up, the level of violence complaints in the current year has gone down to 9.95% of the complaints we've received, hence the 22% decline in that percentage.
Thank you. Nous avons un point d'ordre.
Point of order? Yes, Mr. Chair. Perhaps I did not quite understand correctly, but I seem to hear Mr. Cohen insinuate that Mr. Bigra, our colleague, was perhaps struck with a certain form of illness? Now, I understand that Mr. Cohen is reacting vigorously to this bill, but I believe we can have an amiable conversation. If you will, colleagues, I am used to asking questions, but briefly, Mr. Cohen. And perhaps you gave them early. In terms of absolute numbers, not percentages, but absolute numbers, what is the number of violence-based complaints, the exact number? Between 2000 and 2001, there were 140 complaints with regard to violence on television. But you must understand that in that number are also included complaints with violence on the news, violence in sports. We're not only referring to drama shows. In 2007-2008, until February of this year, there were 114 complaints regarding violence. But you have to understand that on Vision TV, which had an imam discussing the Quran, who mentioned the word jihad, and a number of viewers concluded that that was violence on television. Now, if you could have a breakdown, an analysis of those 114 complaints, I'd ask you to send it to the committee. Second thing, you've repeated that that was an obligatory code and that it was only voluntary in its title. And because we do find that in the title, but we also find it in your brochure, where you referred to a voluntary code with regard to programming. And also in your brochure, there are a number of voluntary codes. Now, if the code isn't voluntary, perhaps you should change the title of the code. Well, that's a very good suggestion, Mr. Chair.
End this round, and if we would please stay for a few, within 30 seconds, we'll go to a public meeting, but not broadcast, in order to do perhaps some committee business. Merci, messieurs. Thank you very much for being here.
you.